Hey guys, Modelling Weekly here. Today's video is going to be a little different than usual, though I think you'll enjoy it all the same. I'll be painting up ICM's Chernobyl Deactivators, which will then be placed into a sort of what-if vignette, which will be made later on in the video. It's going to be quite a long one, so sit back, relax and enjoy the video. There isn't much plastic in the box, though looking at what there is, it seems to be of a very nice quality. A very slight orange peel texture can be seen on the surface in some places, and there's a couple of mould defects here and there, though overall the detail is crisp with little to no flash. Definitely not bad at all for an injection moulded figure set. As per usual, all the grey plastic was glued together using Tamiya Extra Thin. In a few places, mould seams were prevalent, so Tamiya grey putty was essential in dealing with these. It was sanded down with various grades of sandpaper after having dried fully. I'll just quickly take this moment to say a massive thanks to my channel members, the amazing people that have decided to go the extra mile in supporting the channel. Your support is insane and I'm really grateful for it. Find out more about channel memberships by clicking the join button down below. Anyway, back to the video. I pretty much built these figures straight out of the box, with the exception of their spray guns, or however you'd like to call them. I replaced the plastic rod parts with brass tubing, as not only does it feature a handy little hole in the end, but it also eliminates any remnants of flash that would be difficult to clean up otherwise. I then tried to imitate some coiled up hoses by wrapping some lead wire around a couple of the figures' torsos. This helped to break them up a little bit, as otherwise they're pretty monotone. That's the first guy done, on to the second. I only filmed the construction of 2 of these figures, as the other 2 pretty much follow the same steps, and I'd rather not bore you too much. Mr. Mahogany Surfacer was used for pretty much all priming jobs in this video. It was a perfect dark base layer on which pre-shading and glazing could later be applied. It was sprayed through my 0.4mm HS Ultra at around 20 psi. Spraying from a top-down direction, a dusting of white was then applied. This is an essential step in the way I plan to paint the figures. I'll be using Night Shift's technique of combining basic pre-shading with very thin glaze-like layers of main colour later on, which should provide some nice tonal variation, at least that's the plan. Russian uniform was used to paint the 2 unprotected deactivators, so to speak. A wet palette was pretty much essential in keeping the paint at a very high level of dilution at all times. Highlights were added by hand to certain creases in the figure's uniform in order to further increase tonal variation on the surface. The paint used here was Russian uniform lightened with white. Light green blue was used to pick out the knee-high plasticky boots that the deactivators are wearing, and this same colour will be used later on for the entire gown of the other figure. The soles of the boots were painted using Vallejo Black grey. It was then essentially just a case of painting the other smaller details that I'd missed out previously. This included painting belts with a leather brown, piping again with black grey, and areas of skin which I'll describe in more detail in a second. This is a nice mid-tone that can then be added to with lighter and darker colours, creating some nice depth. Obviously, I'm no expert at figure painting, as you can tell, so the result could definitely look much better. Flat flesh was used to add any highlights, mainly on the knuckles and flat areas of skin such as the sides of the thumbs. As I mentioned previously, pretty much the entire surface of the gowned figure was painted with Vallejo light blue-green, again using the glazy technique like before. It was actually pretty enjoyable adding the highlights to this guy, as the moulding features some pretty serious creases that react well to being picked out with a lightened base colour. I forgot to mention this earlier, but these highlight layers aren't nearly as thinned as the base coat in order to maximise on opacity. Now into the same process as with the last figure, picking out details that weren't painted before. Camo green was used for the storage tank on the figure's back, with the spray gun painted the same black-grey and the mask camo green as well. Some basic chipping and wear was added to the storage tank using a sponge and a lightened version of the camouflage green base. So here's the whole squad painted up. As I mentioned before, I built and painted the other two off camera, though the process was pretty much the same, with very similar colours. They were all given a coat of Mr. Colour GX114 matte varnish, which set them ready for a nice bit of weathering. Weathering was initiated with a simple dark brown oil wash, created using white spirit and of course oil paint. Any excess was simply blended in with a white spirit dampened brush. Some further basic highlights were added by dry blending in oil paints with a soft brush. This worked out pretty nicely and was quick and easy to do. The colours had to be mixed manually though, it wasn't too time consuming. I really wanted these figures to look hardened and dishevelled to a certain extent, so to help with this I used a toothpick to spatter various splashes and mud textures onto their trousers, and of course the other guy's gown. So that's it with the figures. We'll see more of them later, but for now, onto the diorama itself. I immediately hit a road bump when I started the diorama. I needed a way to efficiently cut the styrene block that would be used as the base, and in order to solve this problem, I decided to hop onto a 3D CAD software called Fusion 360, in which I designed the handle and assembly for a homemade hot wire foam cutter. This took about half an hour of working, though by the end of it I had a design that could be 3D printed using my Ender 5 FDM printer. After hooking up a resistance wire and 7.5 volt battery, I went to town with the foam cutter. It worked really well at removing nice chunks of material, so I'd call it a pretty good success. Any rough edges or sharp corners in the surface of the foam were brought back using the flame from a stove lighter. This is a really effective step, though you need to be careful not to melt the foam too much. I decided that I wanted a sort of water outlet going into the ditch I'd made on the edge, so I used a pair of tweezers and brute force to remove material where I wanted it. The pipe itself will be made from an ever so slightly modified Tamiya oil drum. To give the pipe/oil drum a bit of extra steel texture, I used an old brush to stipple on some Mr. Color Surfacer 1500, which actually worked out pretty nicely. The next diorama elements to be prepared were various coils of barbed wire that would be featured on the lower side. These were made using a pretty wide pen, along with some imitation 135 scale barbed wire that I bought off eBay. With the shapes of the barbed wire formed, I wanted to try out using a product I've never really thought about before, burnishing fluid. It's supposed to act as a sort of primer for metal and photo etch parts, and I have to say it worked out pretty well. I dunked the coils in for about a minute each, and by the end of the process they had a very nice tarnished look about them. This tarnished look was further improved with some speckled rust paint of various tones and intensities. Next up after the barbed wire were the posts holding it up themselves. I made this by first chopping up some strips of balsa wood into smaller pieces, followed by texturing with the teeth from a razor saw. The posts were sort of primed by hand with Vallejo Black paint, which served as a good base for some custom paint mixes later on. Some old, rotten wood colours were then mixed up by hand and applied pretty thinly on top of the black base coat. I can't say the exact mixes unfortunately, as they were done by eye, but I essentially went for a primarily grey tones with a touch of brown to imitate old rotten wood. Back to the barrel pipe from earlier. It had now dried, so it was first based with a custom mix of XF7, 9 and 6 in order to get a nice medium rust tone. The stippling sponge made a return at this point, this time to apply various tones of LifeColor rust to the surface of the pipe, giving it much more tonal variation and depth. At this point, I painted up various accessories that would be strewn across the diorama in order to make it look much more apocalyptic. This included a large plastic barrel, which was given some shading with a Tamiya pin wash, as well as a canister of some kind and 4 different jerry cans painted up in 3 different colours. With the accessories, so to speak, all complete for now, I moved back onto the diorama. I wanted to create a nice flat road section at the top corner of the scene, which I intended to do with an air drying clay. Now, in order to get a square edge, I first used balsa wood strips secured in place with sewing pins, which would act as a border for the Darce white clay. The clay itself was a little tricky to apply, as the surface was practically flat with no texture, though it went down fine after working it in a bit. Once it had been applied, I used a pretty wide palette knife to smoothen out the edges as best I could and to make the top surface as flat as possible. This wasn't a completely essential step, as straight after I used a sanding block to make it perfectly smooth, though it definitely saved a lot of time. Talking of the sanding itself, I used a 240 grit sandpaper to get a fairly smooth result. With the road done, I began work on the rest of the terrain. This was all laid down using the same Darce air drying clay as before, except this time it was far more forgiving due to the rough foam surface texture. I didn't want the jerry cans and other items to be floating on the surface of the ground, so a very important step was laying down cling film and then adding impressions of the different elements in the surface of the clay. Once the clay had dried, I applied a thick coat of a custom mud concoction that I created using fine sand, dried dirt from the garden, and PVA glue. The texture formed by this was a perfect representation of the gritty ground that I envisioned, so I'm glad I did it. While it was still wet, I sprinkled some leaves, sand and dirt into the mud to add some extra texture. As the ditch to the side of the seam was going to be filled with resin water to some extent, I decided to texture it with AK wet ground diorama texture, which has a much smoother, wet appearance than the custom mix I made. Some static grass tufts were then added pretty sparingly, though I thought it was a good touch in the end. They were stuck in place using CA glue, as PVA doesn't set fast enough to provide a realistic bond with the ground. With all the ground elements finished, the entire base was primed with the same Mr. Mahogany Surfacer as before. It was a little hard to tell when the mud was primed, though I think it proved effective in the end. The first bit of precision paintwork on the base was a primary mottling layer on the road surface, and this was essential in achieving a realistic tarmac finish in the end, so I made sure to make it as precise as possible. The main road surface colour was Tamiya Rubber Black, as it has that nice touch of grey/blue in it that separates the colour of tarmac from being pitch black. This was sprayed pretty thinly in order to prevent concealing the mottling work done previously. Now for some road markings. I started off by laying down a pretty thick coat of heavy chipping fluid, which would allow me to later distress the marking along the side of the road. The marking itself was masked off and sprayed with AK Real Colours white, gradually being built up to have lighter and darker patches as a sort of mock mottling effect. Simple old tap water was then used in combination with a tattered brush to distress the marking, removing fairly big chunks to imitate wear and tear. All the roadwork was sealed in with a nicely thin coat of GX114 matte varnish, ready to be masked up for the work on the ground. I started off by spraying the grass tufts with Tamiya NATO green, as spraying them after the ground itself would result in a lot of overspray, which would then need to be cleaned up, wasting time in the long run. Highlights were added to the tufts with a pretty light dusting of Cockpit green, which has a bit more of a lime-like colour to it. With the grass all painted up, the surrounding ground was first based with a custom mix of flat earth, hull red and black, which created a nice gritty, wet ground colour. Finally, highlights were added by spraying a mixture of flat earth and buff onto any raised clumps of mud and dirt. Back to the enamel effects now. I used the same combination of turned dirt and dry earth that was used when painting the figures themselves, so that they would blend into their surroundings a little bit better. A large round brush was used to apply the enamels pretty generously, and they were later wet blended together using a white spirit dampened brush. Sepia oil paint was used to add some extra wear and tear to the road surface, specifically skid marks caused by tyres from passing vehicles. It could also represent oil spills or leaks from cars or trucks. I took this moment to finally add all the diorama elements that have been left out until now. This included the figures, barbed wire, jerry cans and everything else. They were all fixed in place nicely with CA glue in order to get a strong bond. This barbed wire was a little fiddly to get in place, though it easily punched through the clay and acrylic mud into the foam beneath, so it was fine in the end. What diorama is complete without a bit of animal life, right? With all those bits and pieces added, I sealed up the edges of the ditch with some pieces of glass from cheap picture frames and got to work with the resin. It was pretty thick, so this pipette was a write-off, though it went in and settled very nicely. After letting the resin cure for about 2 days, I began sanding down the edges with a Dremel so that they'd appear flat once the dia was finished. Of course, the sandpaper used here was very coarse, so I smoothed it out and polished it later with some finer stuff. Some ripple effects were added to the top of the water using a brush and Podge Gloss. It's a simple technique, yet pretty effective. All that was left to do now was paint the sides of the diorama with a nice flat black, and it's done. So here it is, fully complete and rocking its custom sign there on the front. This project took a long while to complete, as I had to pause on it for quite a long time to build and paint my Zero, but nonetheless it's finished now and I'm pretty happy with the result. I wanted to achieve a very dark, drab and dystopian effect with the colour palette, and I'd say that that's worked out pretty nicely. Your eyes are sort of drawn to the 4 figures, which was essentially the idea, with the groundwork being secondary. In terms of things I'd do differently, I think the figure standing in the muddy area could benefit from being a little more vertical, and overall the scene is arguably a bit busy, but I don't think this affects it too badly. Comment what you think down below, and like if you enjoyed, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next video. Thanks very much for watching, and see you next time. Bye!